Good evening and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Catherine Shreves, and I'll be your host for this evening's program. My co-host, Doris Baylor, is away. Our topic tonight is immigration, and my guest is Sarah Brenes. Sarah is an attorney, and she is the director of the Refugee and Immigrant Program at the Advocates for Human Rights, which is a nonprofit based in Minneapolis. They represent refugees and immigrants seeking asylum, and they're also a human rights organization and have women's human rights program as well. It's an impressive organization. It has a small staff that leverages thousands of volunteer lawyers and lay people to help do their work. So, welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight. I know you're busy, and I know that you are representing hundreds of refugees and immigrants. So let's just start out by you telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting when I think about how I first was introduced to immigration and how it's really come full circle. The first time I was ever on an airplane and left the United States was when I went to Tijuana, Mexico, when I was in college. And this was shortly after there were laws enforced to strengthen our border and limit the ability for immigrants to access benefits in California. And little did I know that several decades later, I would be assisting individuals who were coming to the United States. We saw, as a result of Proposition 187 and other federal laws that strengthened the border, it pushed a lot of the migration from the California area to Arizona and Texas, and what we've seen over decades is more challenging, more restrictive policies on immigration. And at the same time, shortly after that, went to Guatemala, right before the peace accords for their civil war were signed, and now seeing the aftermath of the Civil War and seeing how our immigration policies and the asylum policies didn't offer sufficient protection to individuals fleeing those civil wars. And now I think as a result of our geopolitical decisions in the United States, as well as our immigration policies, we're now seeing another crisis of people needing protection coming to the U.S. and facing challenges in accessing the process that we have in place that is part of our international human rights commitment.
Tell us a little bit about the Advocates and how it was founded and the kind of work that you do there.
Yeah, so the Advocates was founded in 1983. Don Frazier was one of our founders and was a group of lawyers that was interested in building momentum for the human rights movement. And so two of the pillars of our work is all of our work relates somehow to the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and all of our work engages volunteers. Majority of volunteers are lawyers, but there's also teachers and people with language skills and other individuals that are interested in getting involved in learning about human rights and assisting in the work that we do on both a global level. We do international human rights work, and then we also help individuals through the program that I direct, the Refugee and Immigrant Program. We assist hundreds of asylum seekers, human trafficking survivors, unaccompanied children, detained immigrants on a day-to-day basis.
So how do they find you? How does someone who has come into this country and let's say they've been picked up by the Border Patrol, how do they find advocates to try to get some representation? And do you charge them?
We offer our services for free, and most of the cases that we accept are placed with volunteer attorneys who we train and support in providing the direct representation. If someone's has a case before the immigration court, they receive a list of free legal service providers, and we're one of the service providers that are on that list. So they could call us there. Our number is posted at the detention facilities.
Anywhere in the country? A detention facility anywhere in the country could call advocates, you would be listed?
They could. Usually the court that is overseeing someone's case would give them the list of the providers in their area. So in our detention facilities in Minnesota, they're posted. However, we also have a national asylum helpline. So individuals who have been detained at the border, some of the family detention facilities, they have a card and they can call us. because if they're, let's say they're detained in Texas, they have a list of legal service providers in Texas, but once they're released and they go to another part of the country, they need to find legal services where they're living. And so they can call our line and we will get them connected to legal service providers there. And since we opened that line in the summer of 2015, we've received over 5,000 calls from individuals. And that line is also staffed by volunteers who we mostly get calls from Spanish speakers, so Spanish speakers that come in and help people get connected to legal services regardless of where they are in the country.
So for example, if you have a volunteer who's Spanish speaking but not a lawyer, could they be somebody who could volunteer in your office and take in calls, intake calls?
Definitely, they could help with the line. We also have volunteer interpreters and translators that help with translating documents related to cases or assist with our intake or help our volunteer attorneys who don't speak the language their client speaks and are able to assist in that way.
Okay. So one of the things that I was struck by were the statistics on who is granted asylum if they have an attorney versus if they don't have an attorney representing them. Do you have some of the statistics that you could share with us on that?
Yes, there's some statistics available on just the difference representation can make. There's a survey. The University of Syracuse University has a system that tracks a lot of data related to various topics, and immigration is one of them. And so they had some statistics. I think the one that we have most recent was a 2015 statistic that showed for family units, families with children. That's one of the categories of individuals who are coming seeking protection. Without a lawyer, they had a 2.3% chance to remain in the country, and with a lawyer it was 32%. And for unaccompanied children, so kids who are under 18 and enter the United States without a parent, it was about 15% chance they could stay in the country if they didn't have an attorney, and 75% if they did have an attorney.
So for children, it sounds like it makes a huge difference to have an attorney.
It does, and in the immigration system, regardless of your age, there's no public defender in immigration. So it's your responsibility to find and hire a lawyer, whether it be a private attorney or a free lawyer that can help you with your case. You have a right to have someone there with you, but the government wouldn't provide, even for a small child, to have representation in immigration court.
Wow, even for a small child. Mm-hmm. So how many calls in a year has your office received?
Well, since 2014, when we started to see more asylum seekers coming to the United States, it's grown exponentially. We typically, for the existence of the organization, probably would get 200, 250 calls that we do an actual intake for someone who's seeking asylum, and last year it was over 700.
Wow.
And our caseload, when I started, we had about maybe 200 cases, and now we have over 600 asylum seekers who we're assisting, which has to do with an increase in the number of people seeking asylum and just the high volume of cases that is causing a delay in them being processed.
So, we at the League of Women Voters, we had a civic buzz last night, a panel of 4 people, and they were talking about asylum and refugees, and somebody asked, like, this is way too confusing, what can I do to learn more? So somebody told me you had an Asylum for Dummies elevator speech that might be helpful to share.
We do get that question a lot, the difference between a refugee and asylee, and the legal definition, the substantive definition is essentially the same, but the process is different. For refugees who are outside of their country of origin, they've gone through the legal process, oftentimes maybe in a refugee camp, and usually have a very long wait. But once they've been recognized as a refugee, then they might be resettled in a country like the United States. So they'd come into the United States with refugee status, have the ability to work, access the social safety net to help start their new life here. For asylum seekers, anyone who's present in the United States can apply for asylum, but they are starting the legal process once they're already here. And so our work focuses on those individuals who are going through the legal process to meet the definition of a refugee, which essentially is someone who's outside of their country of origin and they have a well-founded fear of persecution that's on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and the government of the country that they're from cannot or will not protect them. So, and it's their burden to establish all of those elements before the adjudicator, that might be an asylum officer or the immigration judge. And so we, as you can imagine, that's very complicated and difficult to do on your own. And so that's why we're here to help people navigate that process.
And when somebody comes into this country seeking asylum, do they have to make an application within a certain period of time?
Yes, the U.S. has a law that's somewhat unique from other countries that requires that people file their asylum application within 1 year of having entered the United States or meet an exception to that rule.
So, for example, if I came in, if a refugee came into, no, that's not it. If an immigrant comes in and waits longer than a year and contacts advocates or any lawyer, unless they meet some obscure exception, they really cannot receive asylum because they've missed a deadline?
Well, if they don't meet an exception, there are other humanitarian protections available. We loosely define them as the gold, silver, and bronze status in terms of what protections you receive. So asylum would be the gold standard that you have to file within a year. It would allow you to apply for permanent residence and later U.S. citizenship. You can bring your family members, and they would be able to get status through you, your spouse, and children that were under 21 when you filed for your asylum claim. You can travel outside of the United States as long as you don't go back to the country from which you sought asylum, and can access work authorization and other supports while you're here. And then the other protections, withholding of removal, will basically prevent you from being removed, but you get a work permit. You can't leave. That doesn't put you on a path to permanent residence or citizenship, and you wouldn't be able to use that status to be able to bring your family members here to join you. And then there's a final bronze status, is the Convention Against Torture relief for individuals who fear that they would be tortured by their government or someone that their government would allow them to be tortured by in their home country. And sometimes they get a work permit. Sometimes those individuals that receive Convention Against Torture relief might be in a detention facility here and wouldn't even be allowed to be released in some cases. But those other protections, withholding and CAT, as we call it, are available to individuals who wouldn't be eligible for asylum.
So in the work that you at Advocates do, are you connected with the Center for Victims of Torture and the Minneapolis, what is the Minneapolis, there's a refugee and immigration office in Minneapolis. Do you have some work with those? Does your work interface with them at all?
Yes, one of the greatest, so there's a couple of things that makes it, as difficult as this work is, a couple of things that make it really great about doing this work in Minnesota. One is the volunteers and the support for pro bono services by attorneys and by the firms, both individual attorneys and firms here in our state have really an overwhelming amount of support. And then the collaborative nature and the partnerships that we have, both among the legal service providers. A lot of the work that we're doing for detained immigrants is not possible without partnerships with the other legal service providers that are in our state. And then the other providers like Center for Victims of Torture, the International Institute of Minnesota, and others that can help provide some of the support services, because as an asylum seeker, there's a wait period to get a work permit, and you're not eligible for a lot of the public benefits, including some of the social services for mental health services and medical services that citizens would be eligible for. So the support from organizations that are able to provide those really critical wraparound services for clients that we're providing legal services to is critical, and we're really thankful for those partnerships.
Wow. So one of the things that, I know we're very far from the southern border in Minnesota, but I wanted to talk a little bit about immigration in Minnesota. Justin Hollis from the Wilder Foundation was at the League of Women Voters Civic Buzz last night, and he had some statistics from Minnesota Compass, and the website is mncompass.org, and they have all sorts of demographic information about Minnesota. And one of the charts that they have shows that the foreign-born population 100 years ago was mainly from Germany, Norway, and Sweden. And now it's the people that are coming in are mostly Hmong, Latin America, or Somalia, excuse me. And so it's just a very different group of people coming in than 100 years ago. But also we have, in the changes in population in Minnesota in the last decade, Justin shared a chart that showed that Minnesota had an increase in population of about 300,000 in the last decade. And over 200,000 of that was just natural increases, more births than deaths. But 100,000 of it was immigration. And in fact, for US-born citizens, we lost over 25,000 people who moved to warmer states or moved for work. So just in terms of keeping our current 8 representatives in Congress, it's important to remember how much we benefit from immigration in Minnesota. So with that, I thought maybe you could give us a brief history of how we have, and I know you sort of touched on that when we first started talking, but just a little bit about how we've gotten to this crisis with just a flood of not just unaccompanied minors starting in 2014, but also families. And it's a complicated, and we can
How
go.
much time do we
Yeah,
have
we've got, but I think it would be helpful to give some background to people because we all know what we're reading in the paper, but it would be helpful to know what you're hearing from the people that you're seeing and what is driving this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really difficult to. A lot of times when people talk about immigration, there's sort of the push factors and the pull factors. And I think really critical when you think about migration within our hemisphere is important to understand the geopolitical relationship that we've had with Latin America over many decades, from the 1950s to earlier, and how the interplay between programs that we had in the United States using temporary workers in the Bracero program, and how we continue to use temporary workers and really relay the message of needing labor but not welcoming our neighbors as part of the community can be problematic. How we've supported different administrations in the countries in Central America that led to some of the turmoil that happened in the 80s and 90s in those countries that brought an initial flow of a lot of refugees. That at that time, when you look at the asylum policies in the 80s and the 90s, there were many people that were seeking protection, and the response was being overwhelmed and really turning people away from getting protection then. And so we're seeing history repeat itself. What we saw in that situation was, after a lot of litigation that we're seeing happening again, there was eventually a fix that that ended up providing some stability and protection for some individuals.
And what was that fix?
Well, it was a law called NACARA, which basically recognized that the U.S. government had turned away and just sort of did quick denials of asylum claims for individuals that were trying to present their claims there. I think it's a little more complex, even more complex now, but nonetheless, just sort of seeing a response of saying, oh, there's so many people coming, these must not be illegitimate refugee claims, and not really learning from history in that regard. I think the other changes that we saw in U.S. policy in the mid-90s was a change in the law, both with expedited removal, which made it more difficult for people, or more quickly people turned away that came to the border, and set up the credible fear process that now has a policy of detaining more asylum seekers at the front end if they're coming to the border or requesting at the airports. And
Can you explain expedited removal a little bit more? Because it's just read in the paper, it's been expanded more recently, but can you explain what that is?
So the expedited removal process was basically started to, if someone presents themselves at the border, then they're subjected to expedited removal unless they claim a fear of returning to their country of origin. And if that happens, then it triggers a credible fear interview, which is conducted by an asylum officer, which is basically a brief asylum interview that has a slightly lower threshold, and someone needs to pass that in order to even get a chance to apply for asylum with the immigration judge. And in most cases, individuals are detained while they're waiting for that interview after oftentimes a very long, harrowing journey to get to the United States in the first place. And then if they're credible, if they found to have a credible fear, then they can apply for parole and request that they be released so that they can present their claim and have time to gather evidence and find legal representation for their case. If they don't get parole, then they'd have to fight their case from the detention facility. So that was a policy that was started, and there's an attempt to expand it. I think the latest was it's been put on pause while it continues to work its way through the courts, but essentially was trying to expand that. So typically you need to have found within 100 miles of the border and within 14 days of entry. Now it's the proposal that was made by this administration was to expand that to say if you're found to be in the country for 2 years after having entered, which is quite an expansion of that
Wow.
program, and subjecting people to more detention and limitations on their ability
So
to
when
access the
somebody is confronted, if it's expanded to be 2 years, somebody is confronted, I'm assuming, by an ICE officer, and they make the determination of credible fear? Is that the person who does it? It doesn't go to a judge at a court?
So the credible fear interview would be by the ICE officer or
Wow.
the Customs and Border Patrol officer that they're
Okay.
encountering. And then the credible fear interview itself is supposed to be conducted by an asylum officer.
Okay.
And then if they pass that, then they get to go to present their case before the judge.
So how long do you have to study immigration law before you can practice immigration law?
Well, we have frequent trainings, and we support our volunteers that are willing to jump in the deep end, but it's definitely possible.
So what other immigration trends are happening that we should know about? I mean, people have talked about the gang violence in Central America. They've talked about climate change as being a driver in Central
Yeah.
America.
So the gang violence, probably one of the most famous gangs, the MS-13, that's operating in many different countries, but started in Los Angeles, which was basically a way for Salvadoran immigrants that were living there to protect themselves from other gangs that were in that area. And then the U.S. immigration law in 1996 was very expansive in deporting a lot of individuals with criminal histories back to the country of origin. And so from there, we've started to see an increase in the operations of a lot of these gangs that are operating in the Northern Triangle, which includes Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, are probably the major drivers. We also have seen a lot of asylum seekers from Nicaragua. Both Nicaragua and Honduras have some serious political issues that are happening as well. So not just fleeing gang violence, but also those who are trying to be involved in the political processes there that have been fleeing as well.
So that's interesting because I haven't heard, I mean, we hear about the Northern Triangle a lot, and I haven't heard about Nicaragua as much.
Yeah, so we've seen a lot more political dissidents that have been fleeing that region as well, and Venezuela has gone up. We've seen a lot more Cubans that have been coming to the United States seeking protection. So really, all over the region, people continue to seek access to the asylum process here so they can have their claims heard. So
can you talk a little bit about how people could plug into advocates? What are the opportunities to help, and how do they go about reaching out to advocates to help?
Well, we have a number of different opportunities. As I mentioned, most of the volunteers that my program works with are volunteer attorneys. So we have a number of different training programs and work with attorneys who are at small firms, large firms, solo practitioners, and have training courses and offer mentorship if they're interested in taking a case. We also have other opportunities if they want to help with briefing or other smaller tasks if they don't want to take on a full case, sort of an entry-level piece. And we also have a program that pairs volunteer attorneys with individuals trying to have their bonds be reconsidered by the judge. So if someone, in many cases, if someone's apprehended by immigration, there is a bond or a bail amount that's set, and they can ask the judge to reconsider that. And so sometimes people have to decide between posting the bond or using that money to hire an attorney, and by providing a pro bono attorney, we can hopefully lower the bond so then they can get released from detention and be able to seek legal counsel once their case slows down a bit after they're out of the detention facility. We have other opportunities for volunteers to be involved in the court process. We have a court observer program, and you don't have to be an attorney, and it's a way that keeps the public's eyes and ears in the courtroom and holds the government accountable, so they're upholding principles of justice and due process in our immigration courts. And we've observed over 2,000 immigration hearings since we started that program.
Is that, was that part of the advocates taking watch in as part of the advocates?
That was actually before we started watch. The observer
Okay.
program started a couple years ago now,
Okay.
and has been in our to observe detained court hearings, and so
Okay.
there's a training and people can go in and
Okay.
observe and
Well,
take
that's
notes.
great. That's
Yeah.
great to know. There's one other volunteer opportunity I thought people should know about, and that is through October, there's a program called Books for Border Kids. And Wild Rumpus in Minneapolis and Red Balloon in St. Paul are sending books. You can go in and buy the books, or you can call in and pay over the phone, just make a gift of $50 or whatever, and they will send books to bookstores on the border for children.
Oh, wow.
So they're
That's great.
so there are lots of opportunities to volunteer if you want to do that. Sarah, thank you so much for coming, because I know that you're so busy representing people in need. So I want to thank you for coming. And so Sarah's the Director of Refugee and Immigrant Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. And I want to thank you for tuning in to We the People. And my name is Catherine Shreves, and I want to thank you for joining us, and we hope you join us again. Good night.